incredible band. Sometimes I like to put on the headset microphone and pace around and yell things. Sometimes I like to put up funny pictures and read long passages of book quotes. And sometimes it is nice to just be right here. So tonight together we're just going to be right here. We have been in a series we're calling Doing the Hardest Thing. And I think for a human being, the hardest thing is giving and receiving love. This series came out of a community discernment that we do every 6 months where we sit around tables, and it's actually a group project where we say each table, if you had 4 weeks, 4 Sundays to do whatever you wanted at Dwell Church, what would you do? What topic would you do? Would it be sermons or something completely different? No music or just music? Think of the wildest idea you possibly can. Integrate it into your little presentation. Then we go around the room and they say, this is what I would do. This is what our table would do. One of those tables said, we need to talk about love. What is it? Why are we so bad at it? How do we get better? And so that's what we have been doing. As a leadership team, we decided to orient this series, or at least place it on the calendar during this election season, where we're asking some really hard questions of ourselves, of our country, and what it means to love your neighbor. Last week, you might remember, we asked the question, what is love? We said it was 4 things. 1, it's super vulnerable. Love is a deeply vulnerable thing. Sometimes we say it is sacrificial, but that makes it sound like a chore. But we need to capture something that is warm and powerful, but also costly. Vulnerability does that for us. We asked, again, was love a choice? Is it a feeling? Is it an action? And we saw that love is actually integrated. It is all of those things. It requires you to do all of those things to have real love. We saw that love is a high effing standard, that you have to love your enemy. That's what Jesus invited us to do. And that is one of the reasons why we settled upon this theme during the election season. One way or another, we are going to have to love some people that maybe it does not come so naturally for us to love. And then we also said love starts with God. We'll be exploring that each week. And part of what we want to capture there is we can simply ask God for more love in our hearts. That we could make a long list of people that we have trouble loving, or people that we love dearly, and we could say, God, would you help me love them to a greater degree in your name? See, God invented love. It was his idea. He gives love to us. He makes love possible. Any place we see love out in the world, even if it is not a follower of Jesus, that is God winking at you and saying, see, I'm at work in all things. When a mother loves a child, when a friendship blossoms, when people fall in love, that is God winking and saying, this is the realest thing in the universe. So we can ask for more love. And you might remember last week we said we know that there are a lot of variables on Election Tuesday. So we mapped out 3 scenarios. One scenario we called, wow, it worked out. That scenario did not transpire. One scenario we called, it's ambiguously locked up in the courts, and we'll have to cope with the reality that we really have no control over anything in human life. That's the middle scenario, and we had a scenario we called the red wave. And we mapped out what would we say in each one of these. And as you are no doubt aware, this was a red wave election cycle. And we have since had to cope with what will 4 years with Donald Trump as the 47th president of the United States look and feel like. And as we thought about that, each one of us in our own way, also as a society, there are so many things maybe we can make good guesses at. And there are so many things that we do not know. And there are so many things that are like kind of unspeakably horrible to imagine. Sometimes I think a lot of people have a lot of money tied up in the ongoing existence of the United States of America. That alone means it will continue in some way, shape, or form. And then I think about the worst case scenario, and I think it is pretty bleak if I think directly about it. Now, I'm a person who believes that a fear-based theology will warp you in your internal person. And so I am determined to have something besides that. And that's what I hope to share with you today. 2 notes before we start. One is you got this little piece of paper right here. This is what it's supposed to look like, all folded up, crumpled a little bit, bunch of names scribbled on it. Here's what this is for. These don't have to be enemies or anything election related. These are just people that God put on your heart. And I hope that over the next month you will simply write their names on it, carry it with you, pray for them. Whenever it occurs to you, lunch break or car commute or whatever it might be, walk around the neighborhood, hike along the coast, pray for the people that God has put on your heart. As I thought about this last week, these are just 14 names that God has maybe put into my life in some way. And I'll just simply be praying for them. And sometimes, if nothing else, this act of acknowledgement, remembrance, this token that you exist and are important to me, that's a powerful act of love. We'll just ask God to bless the names on each one of our lists. That's our homework, our spiritual exercise for this series. 4 of my names are 4 guys that I've known since the 1st and 2nd grade. And every year I get together with them. They all, quite independently of one another, became pastors. And some of them I went to college or seminary with. These are my lifelong buddies. Next weekend is our annual get together, hang out, pray for each other in Denver, Colorado. So I will be flying in like right before our service. I'll be here, but Brian will be telling you how much God loves you for 20 minutes of our service. I'll be praying for those guys, and I'll be praying for you. And I hope that you find this life-giving. I hope you find this life-giving. Now, for our little talk here, a place my imagination went to over the past 4 or 5 days are famously the 7 things that Jesus said during his crucifixion, the 7 words of Jesus. And I want to anchor our thinking in about the election, about this week, about how we're going to journey it together, in 3 of these things that Jesus said as he chose. These are my last few things that I will ever say in my bodily human form. This moment where everybody was listening, where everybody was thinking, what is going on here? This unexpected, impossible to imagine, dark moment. What did Jesus say? Because after all, our goal as followers of Jesus is not to win elections, but it is to become more like this Jesus. It is to be formed in our internal people, our internal persons, more into the Christ-likeness, the character of Christ. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, generosity, and self-control. And so even in dark moments in our lives, we can count on a few things that God is at work, that he is present to us, and that he is shaping us more into his image if we surrender ourselves to it. So I want to reflect together about our lives, Dwell Church, the future of our country, and I want to anchor it in the last few things that Jesus said. Remarkably, one of the things that Jesus said from the cross was, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, importantly, this is a quote from Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is a long list of ways to tell God, I am not happy with what's going on. And Jesus, from the cross, gives us great permission to enter into the Hebrew tradition of telling God we don't like it. We don't like what just happened. We don't like what you allowed to happen. In fact, when something bad happens in our lives, in our faith, we really have 3 options. 1, some people choose this. They just give up. Maybe in life, maybe on their faith. But they just say it's simpler to just give up. That happens. Second option is to fake it in some way. To say, well, there's a silver lining here. Maybe it won't be so bad. God has his plans, and there's nothing we can really do about that. The Bible isn't so much full of that, actually. It is somehow full of a lot of the third option, which is to tell God with real honesty what we think. See, you honor God when you tell him your honest, deepest thoughts, because it is an act of trust. I once heard it said that a couple that doesn't fight means one of them has already lost. Because one of them is faking it or has chosen to not show up with their truest self for the sake of getting along, and we can do that in our life with God. But of the 150 Psalms, roughly half of them have some element of, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's actually quite good for your faith to tell God what you really think, because it invites him into the crevices, the dark spots in our life, in our soul. And so simply to say, God, I do not like what happened here. That's a powerful way of inviting him into it. Now, there are key moments in the Bible story where the Hebrew people cry out to God, and one of them is in the Exodus. We'll talk about it in a moment. But what happens after 400 years of slavery in the land of Egypt is the people cry out in this humble but powerful, honest moment, the lament. And they ask God, do you remember us? See, the sharp things that you can say to God in your honest moments. You have real permission to say quite pointed things to God, and he won't show up and smite you. What happens in the book of Exodus is that he listens. The Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann said, crying out to God initiates history. It impacts the world. So together, one thing we will do is simply to lament in this way. Lament has a formula. It's I take the thing that I don't like and I'm honest about it and I offer it to God. And that's all that we can do sometimes. So I know that a lot of people are asking God, how could you let this happen? And you're in the right spot. That's real similar to Jesus saying, how could you? How have you? Why would you? Why have you forsaken me? We could ask all those questions. Now, a painful one for me is why did so many Christians in the end support Donald Trump? We knew it was going to be like that. But see, I have a theory about God, what God was up to in the election around Christians. And I think it centers some on what Dwell has become and will become and how much of a gift it is to me personally. See, as I ask, why did so many Christians support Donald Trump? I also have to think about so many pastors. Now, there are MAGA churches, and that is a problem, but I'm not even talking about those. There's kind of a middle portion of people who I think are well-meaning, and maybe from my perspective, I don't know, are they not listening? I'm not sure, but one way or another, I had to cope with the fact that so many people that I know voted so differently than me. I have a pastor friend that I went to college with, and he's a pastor here in California, actually. Their church is at a very different place on the political spectrum. And he gave a really insightful post. This is why he voted for Donald Trump. And he said, it was actually pretty easy. I thought the economic plan was better. I don't like illegal immigration. And I don't think the woke agenda is that popular. And I thought that was really honest and insightful. And as I digested that all week, this person that I know actually pretty well, I couldn't help but think, I think that is actually like the heart of idolatry. To say, I don't like being around people that aren't like me, and I could get more money out of this, so I actually don't care what else happens. That's exactly what I think idolatry sounds like. And so as I wrestle with why Christians, that is where my imagination goes, but that doesn't help me live any better or differently. That doesn't even have that much satisfying explanatory effect. So here's where my imagination goes. And I hope that this is where we can live together as we journey through this experience. In the story of Elijah, the nation of Israel has begun worshiping other gods, and he has taken on the painful and burdensome role of being God's messenger, a prophet of Israel. And he travels around to different towns, and as he finds out they're worshiping different gods beside the Hebrew God Yahweh, he reasons with them and then actually fights them hand to hand and sometimes destroys these other temples. And finally, he's been single-handedly battling this epidemic of idolatry in the nation of Israel, and he realizes that he has lost, that the calling on his life will not be fulfilled because he couldn't do it. He did not succeed in what God asked him to do. And so even though he's been battling these people who are worshiping these other gods, there are more of them and they are coming for his life, and he is running away on foot. And quite famously, he runs into the desert to just give himself to the wilderness. This is an act of suicide. He's given up. And God comes to him and says, Elijah, what you need is a snack. And he gives to him a bit of bread and honey. And then God says, what you need is a nap. And so Elijah falls asleep under the tree. And then God listens to Elijah's lament that Elijah has done everything that was asked of him and he still failed. And God says, I hear you, and I will pass that job on to someone else. You have done well, and your turn is over. And here's the part that I find so insightful in this passage. God says to him, "But do not despair, because I have reserved 7,000 faithful Israelites just for me." That's what God says. That 7,000 faithful Israelites from among all of the nation of Israel, that was enough for God. This small, faithful little remnant. God was very pleased with that. And so my ambition for us in this time of our lives is simply to be among this small, faithful remnant that does what God is asking of us. That is the one thing that we're going to try to do together. Because that is the one thing that God actually cares about in this profound story about Elijah, exhausted, battling idolatry. God says there were 7,000 faithful Israelites. That would be enough for me. So Dwell Church, my one goal for us is for us to remain there, to remain among the faithful, and to find out that that is good enough for us. Now, one day we will arrive, I think, at understanding of this, that even in a land that we don't like to live in, that we can, as an act of resistance, live happy, joyful, hopeful lives. I think we'll get there together. That's what God is going to call us to do. And that's what it is going to mean to live among the resistance. And that's why it is so important to me to never build a theology or a spirituality based on fear. Because someday, together, we're going to arrive at happy, joyful, hopeful, resistant lives. But not yet. Not yet. Sometimes it helps for a sermon to have a title. Last week's was What is Love? This week is Sometimes Love Starts with Lament. So as we journey through the unveiling of the next couple of months of what a second Trump administration is going to look like, we're going to prayerfully say, God, I don't like that. And I offer the anger and rage and heartbreak and even despair to you. See, we have permission to say, why has he forsaken us? But we also aim to be among the faithful remnant. The second thing that Jesus says from the cross is, forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they do. Again, there's a scenario where, for economic reasons, that there's some mitigated harm here, but there's also a scenario that's pretty darn bleak. And as we lament and bring real honesty in our appraisal of things, here I think we have justice work to do, and we are given real permission of it to say, Father, forgive them. I don't think they knew what they were doing. And here in our series here, we know we are tasked by Jesus with loving our enemies. And I think we get to have the grace, the real honesty of saying, yeah, this feels like some people are my enemies. See, we don't have to pretend about that. We don't have to pretend. But we do have to love them. And we live in that tension of being completely transparently honest about it and still having integrated, vulnerable love that is a choice. But there is an act of accurately naming that what is going on, that is the gift of justice to you and I, that we don't have to pretend. We don't have to say it's not as bad as it is. We don't have to find a silver lining. We can simply say, I don't think they knew what they were doing, and if I was honest, I have to consider them my enemies. That's an okay place to be. That, in Jesus' imagination, is not incompatible with the real act of love. A final thing that Jesus says from the cross that we'll think about today is, into your hands I give my spirit. See, there are remarkable stories in the Bible. We talked about the book of Exodus. The Hebrews were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and yet they were still doing their best to worship Yahweh. Later, African slaves in this continent took that story. They were also slaves for 400 years, and they said, this is the kind of thing that God is up to. And after 400 years of slavery on this continent, African slaves appealed to this God who intervened on their behalf. That is how they understood what was happening. Jesus from the cross says, into your hands I surrender my spirit. Even suffering an act of torture and ultimately execution, he chooses a posture of trust. In a moment, we'll talk about the Hebrew people in a different circumstance. We're captives in a different place in Babylon. So somehow, if these people who are being executed and oppressed and marched off to different continents, if they can trust in this God, I'm sure that we can too. And I don't say that to minimize how we are feeling. I say it to invite you to think that there is a blueprint for thriving before us. Now, I've said before that as a cisgendered white dude, I had a little bit of a different perspective, less at stake in this election. So I will not push you to arrive at determining to live a happy, hopeful, joyful life of resistance. I would love for you to find that in your own way. But this long list of people thriving in an exile land, oppressed in very real and life-threatening ways, well, they found a way in trusting this God. They found a way to live happy, joyful, thriving lives of resistance. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, there's a famous passage. We'll get here in a moment, but I love the context here. It is so relevant to our lives in the sense that the Israelites have just suffered something pretty horrific. They have been conquered. And the intelligentsia, the trained craftsmen, they have actually been deported to serve a foreign kingdom in another land. They are captives in Babylon. They've been marched away. And the people who are left behind were people who could not build a society, could not fend for themselves. And so this was Babylon's strategy for destroying the surrounding nations. Invade, deport the people who could support a society, and leave everyone else behind to slowly die. Interestingly, in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah's opponents are people who are saying, this won't last very long. It's all going to be fine. Yahweh is at work. Don't you even worry about it. There are conflicting prophets in the book of Jeremiah. And that is helpful to know because, gosh darn it, aren't there conflicting prophets going on in the United States of America? And what confirms that Jeremiah is correct is simply that his prophecy is the one that came true. And so he writes a letter. He's actually been identified as someone who could not help to support a society, so he is left in Jerusalem, left behind. And he says, I am the spokesperson for Yahweh. And so he writes a letter to those who are in Babylon. And here's what he wrote. This is the text of the letter. This is Jeremiah chapter 29. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders and exiles in Babylon, to the priests and the prophets, to all the other people who were carried into exile from Jerusalem. Jeremiah wrote, this is what the Lord Almighty, God of Israel, said to those that I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. See, the Hebrew prophets knew God was ultimately responsible for all of this stuff. Here's what I said to those who were carried from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and enjoy what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give daughters in marriage so that they may have sons and daughters. Increase in numbers, do not decrease. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city into which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. You see, something that has occurred to me over this last week is how important Dwell Church not only is to me personally, because connecting with people over the last week, knowing that we were not alone in this, was so profoundly a gift to me. But also where we are in the world, where we are in the course of human history, what Dwell Church could be. Oh, we're just a garden that we are planting in a place that we hope thrives so that we can thrive along with it. And this was from a conquered people, a gift, a word from Yahweh, from the God who will someday be embodied in the person Jesus. He simply said, come into my presence and you can live a thriving life. That thriving garden, that house overflowing with sons and daughters, it is not incompatible with living in a world that you do not like. See the great gift to us of studying someone who faced being conquered, being executed. The great joy of reading a scripture that was written by the losers of the great geopolitics of the day, written from the underside of society, is that they tell us, actually, hope, joy, peace, these are not incompatible with the state you find yourselves in. Now, along the way, we will do the hard work of naming things with accuracy. We will do the hard work of resistance when it falls to us to do so. But not yet. Not if you're not ready. But it lies before you a path to live hope and joy and peace and love, despite whatever else may transpire. And the great gift is that we're going to get to do that together. And so here what we are going to do, which would have been what we were going to do no matter what happened, is to learn to center our lives on the presence and person of Jesus, who taught us that we could be filled with his Holy Spirit. So one way or another, my friends, I hope you arrive once again at a sense of peace and joy, not because life is easy or simple or makes sense, but because Jesus is with you. And we are in it together. Let me pray for you. Jesus, we're so grateful, gosh, that you are with us. That in this great act of solidarity, you joined human life by dying and even despairing, like so many humans have, and like we do too sometimes. That you faced the sense of being forsaken so that we could never be alone when we are feeling that way. God, that you joined us in our despair so that you could teach us to hope in you, to have peace in your presence. God, we lift our lives up to you. Amen. On the last night of Jesus' life, somehow knowing that he was going to be crucified, instead of fleeing or despairing, he had dinner with friends. He chose, despite what he knew to be the circumstances, to have a joyful moment with his closest people. And what he told them was quite remarkable, that he was going to be crucified. But unlike the dozens of crucifixions they had seen before, this one would change their lives. That as they dined together, he said, tonight this is not merely bread, it is my body broken for you to have a new relationship with God. Tonight this is not merely wine, it is my blood spilled for a new covenant. That is Jesus' way of inviting you deeper. So tonight I simply want to invite you deeper. We'll have 2 stations for communion. If you would like to, as a way of saying, yes, Jesus, I would love to come deeper into life with you, you're welcome to come to one of these stations where you will be served the body and the blood of the resurrected Jesus. And as we sing, you can head to your seat, take the elements as you see fit.